Welcome. Today, Chuck and Brock enjoy spending time with Professor Dominic Perler's Chapter 28, Skepticism, from the Cambridge History of Medieval Philosophy. This is generous theology.
Yeah, I agree with that. I think that makes a lot of sense. I think I was just thinking about this too as you were talking about this, and I have to say this is not my own idea, but just this morning, my pastor was talking about this in his sermon. Normally, when one tries to make an argument, let's say you're going to a courtroom trying to prove your case, it is typically much more difficult to prove that something does not exist than it is to prove that something does exist, right? Because in some ways it's almost impossible to prove a negative. And he gave the idea of somebody who decided that they wanted to prove that rhinoceri don't exist because he's never seen one. And then he goes on a trip around the world and he doesn't see them. But all it would take is one person showing up with a rhinoceros to disprove that. And so thinking about that concept, thinking about that idea that it's often harder to prove a negative than it is to prove a positive, I almost wonder whether the popularity of skepticism is a way to deal with the fact that it is much more difficult if you're into proving things to be an atheist than to be a theist. Because to be an atheist, you have to prove that God does not exist, which is a much harder argument to make than to prove that God exists. And we may not be able to prove using empirical techniques that God exists, but neither can we, using those same empirical techniques, prove that he does not exist. And it is a much more difficult proof to make because you deal with all sorts of evidences. You might not accept those evidences per se, but you deal with all sorts of people who will talk about having connections with the divine or the fact that there are so many people who believe. And I almost wonder, given Perler's saying that in the age of faith, there were no philosophers who radically doubted. It was the age of faith, though. It was a time when people believed in God, or the Jewish and Islamic God as well, in those traditions. And even outside of that, there was typical acceptation that there is something beyond merely what one can see, sense with one's five senses. In today's day and age, where we have the strength in certain circles of atheism, for many people, not for all, obviously, but for many people, atheism almost seems to be at the core of how can one think about things today, and atheism just seems to be a base. But to get there almost requires a level of skepticism where you deny the ability to have knowledge. Because if we accept that we can have knowledge, once we accept that, suddenly we're going to have all these other evidences of God that we have to put down, and that atheism becomes a much more difficult row to host. So I wonder if there is a connection. I don't know. I can't prove that there is some connection, that the growth of skepticism was the result of a growing atheism, or it may have gone the other way around. Maybe the growth of atheism was the result of a growing skepticism. I'm not sure. But it does seem to me that there has to be a connection. And if we can accept that we can have knowledge, and in doing so now we start having rational discussions, even if we cannot solely through rational discussion prove that God exists, the atheists have a much more difficult argument to make. And they almost need that radical skepticism. So I don't know what you think about that, but as you were speaking, that was what was coming to mind a little bit to me about why skepticism perhaps has become much more widespread and much more embedded in a much more systematic way rather than just simply methodical kind of way.
Yeah, perhaps it's interesting to consider a question in human anthropology. One of the things that my skeptical friends, whether they be atheists or agnostic or anti theists, my non believing skeptical friends, almost to a person, and when I say almost to a person, I would say that anecdotally, in my own engagements, it has never happened that a skeptic has come to me with an Augustinian frame regarding the human condition. Now, what do I mean by that? Well, let's unpack this. It's pretty standard to open up conversation about human anthropology by asking, are you a good person? And I never hear people in philosophical endeavor who wish to use skeptical methods, I never hear people really come off of this idea that they are not truth seekers. They believe about themselves that they are committed to seeking truth, that they are basically good, that they have faculties that are enabled without hindrance to assess, evaluate, and reason and sense reality. And therefore, on that basis of being a good person, of being a genuine truth seeker, they construct some understanding of it. So there's quite an optimistic approach here, is what I'm getting at. I think we have to ask our skeptical friends that question. Why so optimistic about your inherent goodness? Why think that you are genuinely a seeker after truth? And we would try to then use this skeptical tool, because the Bible presents, and for folks who understand what it means to hold an Augustinian anthropology, it's this understanding that human nature, because of the fall into sin, human nature is not habitually good, but is in fact quite the opposite. So the scriptures testify that people are by nature suppressors of truth. They are by nature God haters. And I think that's something that needs to be talked about very upfront, because if my skeptical friend is being no more than the Augustinian poses him to be, then his skepticism can be very easily explained and understood as not being interested in the truth, if the truth would point to the God that skeptics wish to reject. You know, C.S. Lewis had the famous paraphrase, and I'm not going to quote it quite accurately, but it's something pretty close to non-believers can't find God for the same reason that the thief can't find the police station to turn himself in. There's a conflict of interest here. And right away, I just wish to open that up as a primary concern. If the Augustinians have the anthropology right, then I agree with you. Skepticism is a much harder position to take, because at every stage, there's a reason to be concerned about the worst case situation. That is to say, that the skeptic is merely dressing up in a costume of skepticism, but underneath is just simply unbelief. And so that's, if there is an onus, if there is a burden that a skeptic, I think, has to bear when engaging with a believer, I think it's that. Of course, if one is not, broadly speaking, Augustinian in their understanding of human anthropology, then skepticism seems to be a reasonable tool. If people are basically good, if you and I really are just looking for God, oh, if only we could find him, Chuck. Why is he so hidden from us? And then, of course, by extension, taking that skepticism to the next stage and saying, well, I can't see God, therefore he's not there. Then I think that's where you're going to go when people with an optimistic anthropology, or let's say an anthropology where sin has not completely corrupted and had a terrible effect, I think that's where you're going to go. And so I would put that frame out there very early and maybe just ask the question, do you believe you're a good person? Now, we're already into this a little bit in the chapter, because Professor Perler talks about one of the writings of Henry of Ghent. There's nobody, Christian or non-Christian, who doubts that humankind possesses the ability to acquire knowledge. Now, Ghent opens by saying one cannot reasonably defend the view that knowledge is possible unless one first has a clear concept of what knowledge is. If you don't know what knowledge is, how can you make claims or statements defending it or not defending it? At best, you could make claims of ignorance. And so that means that this primary issue, we're going back to the primary distinction of having faith, let's put it in that sense, that we as humans have knowledge, versus understanding how we can have knowledge, which is the secondary issue. And so I think if we fit the discussion comfortably within those parameters, it's a difficult situation. There's a lot for the non-believer to answer. There's some very serious concerns here. And so that's my response to that. Did I answer where you were interested in there, Chuck? Did I derail it a little bit?
No, it didn't derail it at all. I think it's a really good discussion, and it does reflect that there is a real divide. I think you talk about the Augustinian conception versus a non-Augustinian conception, and there is a real divide, and as such, there's a real divide between those who take on a fully skeptical position and those who really do understand that knowledge is possible, and that we can have knowledge. There may be different ways of getting that knowledge and understanding it, but there is a real divide there. And to some extent, also, there is a burden on those who would take a skeptical or an atheistic position based on even the way they behave in the world. I think you've made this point as well, that it's almost impossible to be completely skeptical, even those who regularly make these skeptical kind of arguments, because we see just in the way we behave in the world, we tend to rely to some extent on faith, right? We may not fully understand exactly how everything works, but if we are skeptical even about our own, what we can see in front of us, and yet we still take steps where we may not fully understand how the car that we're driving, how the internal combustion engine or the electric engine exactly works, and yet we trust that it's been put together. Or even when we buy a car and we look at, well, this make and model has a good track record, and people are telling me we should buy from this particular dealer because he or she is reliable, that kind of thing. And yet we still don't know. We don't know for sure that there might be something wrong with that particular vehicle, or that person may have something specific against us, and yet we still are willing to go on faith. And faith really is in very many ways opposed to skepticism. And there is a difference between, just kind of circling back even to the beginning, there's a difference between full-on skepticism and merely having doubts about things and wanting to dive into things to better understand them. So yeah, that's a real helpful way to frame that.
Thank you, my friend. I think there's one other interesting thing to consider here, and that is you and I are talking about the professional courtesy that a critic should have when engaging in the act of criticism, as well as the reader, the one reading the critic's criticism, should have. So, Chuck, everybody has an opinion. Nobody denies or doubts that. And everybody understands that having opinion is not the same as knowing something. And yet, the lines blur in the transition. We rely upon, for example, the critic who cannot be bothered to carefully represent on the topic that he's being critical of is like the critic who wants to write an article criticizing the symphony performance that he himself couldn't bother to attend. And so there's a professional courtesy that's needed here, both for the critic, the one engaging in the skeptical inquiry, as well as for the one responding to him. Everybody's allowed to have their opinions, but we really have to understand and distinguish between a careful, gentle, measured, scholarly approach and just what one personally or preferentially thinks. And so until the critic has that skill to recognize, we're largely chasing our tail. Chuck, you might research a topic for 20 years, get a PhD in it, and then come to me and say, Brock, this is how this topic is, and lay out your arguments and be extremely convincing. And then we finish your part of the discussion, and then I come up and then I speak and I say, well, I don't know. I just have a feeling that it's not the case. And there's a mismatch there. And I think that's important. One of the first ways in which of skepticism is to have a legitimate place. One of the primary things that we have to worry about is we have to worry about the fall into subjectivism or the fall into preferentialism, whatever word you want to say. This idea that you can study the objective nature of reality for 20 years, but I can come up and just say, well, from my perspective, I feel that you're wrong. And we need to distinguish between those. And so in that sense, I would say skepticism is perhaps the crown jewel of abused tools by people making intellectual inquiries. And so this chapter is welcome because I think the professor gives us an opportunity to interact and use this tool in a way that's not so obviously abusive. So let me throw it over to you for a final thought here in this session.
I don't know that I have much more to add to that. I think you've done a real nice job of setting the parameters for this discussion and why this topic is really important, even in just how we deal with each other, right? How do we, if we're going to engage in argument with others, if we're going to engage in critical thinking, a lot of these concepts and a lot of these ideas that we're talking about are just really very key. And so I appreciate the way that you've done that. I think it'll be interesting. One of the things that I think will be interesting as we continue through the chapter is that there is a little bit, I think, of a narrative from the beginning to the end of the medieval ages as to exactly how skeptical arguments are wielded. And we see perhaps a move towards the way they get used today, even if they don't go all the way in that direction. But it'll be interesting to walk through, starting with Henry of Ghent, but then others like Occam, and later there's Olivy, I think was one, and Craythorne and Buridan, and others. It's interesting how there is a move, a narrative, perhaps one would say, in how this idea of using skeptical methods does evolve, I